Gukesh finally win a game against aronian in Superbet Romania Chess Classic 2025. Alright, let's break down this game move by move. It looks like a sharp and tactical battle. e4, white opens with his king's pawn, controlling the center squares d5 and f5. This is a very common and classical opening. e5, black responds in kind, meeting white's central control and preparing to develop pieces. This leads to open games. Knight to f3, developing the pieces, controlling important central squares, attacing the pawn, and preparing to castle kingside. Knight c3, also controlling central squares and protect the pawn. Bishop b5, white plays the Ruy Lopez, also known as the Spanish opening, a very popular and strategically rich opening. The bishop on b5 attacks black's knight on c6, which is defending the e5 pawn. Now, white ready to castling kingside. Black plays a6, the Morphy defense, challenging white's bishop and forcing it to decide where to go. White retreats the bishop to a4, maintaining the pin on the c6 knight indirectly. If the knight moves, the e5 pawn is under attack. Black develops his second knight to f6, putting pressure on white's e4 pawn and preparing to castle. White castles kingside, bringing his king to safety. This is a crucial step in development. Black also develops his bishop to e7, controlling important diagonals and preparing to castle. White exchanges his bishop for black's knight on c6. This is a typical exchange in the Ruy Lopez. White often does this to damage black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns on the c-file, and potentially gain control of the open c-file later. Black recaptures with the d-pawn, accepting the doubled c-pawns, but opening the d-file for his rook and queen. White moves his rook to e1, defending e-pawn and preparing to potentially use the open e-file. Black develops his queen to d6. White challenges the center with d4, aiming to open the position and create attacking opportunities. Black pins white's knight on f3 with his bishop, restricting its movement. White develops his knight to d2, set a trap. If black take d-pawn with e-pawn, white will win a piece. Therefore, black takes white's d4 pawn with his queen, gaining material, but potentially exposing his queen in the center. White capture the queen. Black captures white's queen with his bishop. In this position, white did not take white's bishop. His knight is attacked by black pawn. Therefore, white plays a strong move, sacrificing his knight on c6. This is a tactical shot to destroy black pawn structure. Black did not take the knight. He chose to save the bishop by takes e-pawn. White captures the bishop with his knight. Black is forced to recapture with his king. Black's king is now in a very exposed position in the center of the board and lose the right to castle. After this position, black win a pawn. The game continue. White plays b3, likely aiming to develop his bishop on c1 and control more squares. Black develops his bishop to d3. White develops his bishop to a3, attacking black's king and forcing it to move. Black moves his king to e6 to escape the check. White brings his rook from a1 to c1, putting pressure on the c-file and potentially preparing to attack black's king further. Black brings his rook from f8 to c8, meeting white's pressure on the c-file and aiming to control it. White pushes his f-pawn, sacrifice the pawn, trying to open lines towards black's king and create attacking opportunities. Black captures the f-pawn with his e-pawn, opening the e-file further. White pushes his e-pawn, attacking black's knight on f6 and trying to restrict black's pieces. Black moves his knight to g4, aiming for e3. White develops his knight to f3, preparing to participate in the attack or defense. Black plays h6, likely to prevent white's knight from jumping to g5. White attacks black's king with his knight, forcing it to move again. Black moves his king to d5, further into the center to attack the knight. White pushes his e-pawn to e6, creating a dangerous pass pawn. White deliberately let black take the knight. In this position, black refused to take the knight. Black find the best move, putting the knight to e3. Pawn take on e7, getting closer to promotion square. Black captures white's knight on d4 with his king. White attacks black's king with his bishop, forcing it to move again. Black moves his king back to d5. White captures black's g7 pawn with his bishop, attacking the rook. This is a crucial position. If rook to h7 attacking the bishop, pawn will promote to a queen. After rook take the queen, bishop take the rook. White is gaining material. Therefore, black has to find the best move. In this position, black pushes his c-pawn, a brilliant move, letting white to take his rook. If white take the rook, black will gaining material. So, white brings his rook from e1 to d1, escaping from knight attack. If black take the rook, the position is balanced after several moves. Therefore, black moves his king to e4, trying to get closer to the knight and the bishop. Now, knight is ready to take the rook. White moves his rook from d1 to d2 to escape from knight attack. Black moves his rook from h8 to f8, aiming to attack white's f-pawn. White captures black's rook on f8 with his bishop. Black recaptures with his rook. White captures black's c-pawn with his rook. Black captures white's f7 pawn with his rook. After this exchange, white has two rooks, black has only one. But black has a knight and a bishop. Black has gaining material advantage. White pushes his a-pawn, likely to attack on queenside. Black moves his bishop to f1, attacking white's pawn. White moves his rook to c8. Black captures white's g2 pawn with his bishop. White attacks black's king with his rook on e8, forcing it to move. Black moves his king to f5. White captures black's bishop on g2 with his rook. Black captures white's rook on g2 with his knight. White captures black's knight on g2 with his king. Now, black has a passed pawn on f-file. Black moves his rook to c7. White attacks black's king with his. Black moves his king to e4. White moves his rook to f6, attacking black's pawn. Black moves his rook to c6, defending the pawn and maintaining control of the c-file. White moves his rook to f7, continuing to probe for weaknesses. Black moves his rook to b6, attacking the pawn. White attacks black's king with his rook. Black moves his king to f5. White attacks black's king again with his rook on f7, another check. Black moves his king back to e4. White continues to check black's king with the rook on e7. Black moves his king back to f5. White checks the king again. Hope the king to f5 and the game end with a draw. But black refused to draw. Black moves his king to g5, trying to escape the checks. White pushes and sacrifices his h-pawn, attacking black's king and forcing it to move again. Black moves his king to g4. Still defend the pawn. White checks the king again with his rook. Black captures white's h-pawn with his king. White moves his king to f3. Black take on b3 and attacks white's king. White captures black's rook on b3 with his king. Black pushes his h-pawn. White push a-pawn. After that, queen to h3 and white resign. 3 pawn against 1 pawn is too much. White realized that this game is impossible to win.